welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we'll continue our reading of Cheerfulness Breaks In by Angela Thurkill. By adding to these a number of evacuated mothers who wished their children under school age to participate in any overexcitement and overeating that might be going on, Kate Carter and Mrs. Bissell, who sat as a kind of permanent committee of public safety, found that they might easily have from 150 to 200 guests. But pinning their faith on the number of colds that were about, they prepared for a maximum of 150. To Kate's great pleasure, Philip Winter came back at about this time on 10 days' leave, asking if he might bring Captain Geoffrey Fairweather, who happened to be quartered near him. Not only was Kate delighted to have two extra in the house, but in her kindly way she thought it would be nice for Mrs. Burkett to see her son-in-law's brother, who might have news from Las Palombas. This was quite a mistake, for the Fairweathers, though devoted brothers, never wrote to each other, relying on chance or their various clubs to bring them into touch from time to time. The only real blot on the entertainment was that Mrs. Gissing had invited herself and her son, choosing a moment when she could not very well be publicly refused. On hearing this, Geraldine managed to get leave from matron for 24 hours, as the only casualty under her care was an ARP warden who had stumbled over some sandbags belonging to a rival section in the blackout and sprained his ankle, also having his nose broken by two zealous ARP helpers who, hearing the noise, had rushed to his assistance, collided in the dark, and fallen heavily across his face. Although Geraldine had rung up young Mr. Gissing's secretary several times, she had not yet seen the film studio, and her mother hoped she had got over her ill-judged affection for him, but such appeared to be far from the case. It was distinctly annoying for Mrs. Burkett to think of Geraldine wearing her heart on her sleeve for young Mr. Gissing to peck at, and she could only hope, though without much confidence, that among the crowd her virginal pursuit would not attract much attention. By 10 o'clock on the morning of the treat, the committee were actively engaged. The Hosier's boys had stoked the stove till it was almost red-hot, and gave out such alarming cracklings that Edward, the invaluable odd man, had to be sent for at full speed from the school allotments, where he was repairing some fencing, to deal with the dampers, which none but he had ever understood. Kate, to whose mind conflagrations from one cause or another were always in imminent danger, expressed her fear that the iron chimney of the stove might cause some adjacent woodwork to begin smoldering with slow combustion, which, growing to a head at about 5 o'clock, would suddenly burst into flame, lick up the Christmas tree and the trestle tables, cause the roof, which was supported by strong steel girders resting on brick walls, to fall in with a crash in 5 minutes, and the whole party would have fled shrieking in wild disorder toward the 3 large exits, whose doors opened outwards, to be incinerated in the horrid mass which the firemen from Barchester, for of Southbridge Fire Brigade she had no opinion at all, owing to knowing most of the members personally when off duty, would not be able to approach for 3 days if indeed they had not themselves been overwhelmed to a man by avalanches of red-hot masonry and jets of white flame 20 feet long. Just as she was trying to decide whether she had better share the fate of the children, nuns, teachers, mothers, and children under school age, and other members of the school staff, or make her escape for her children's sake to be despised by mankind forevermore, Edward, answering her spoken question, which had merely been, "Oh, Edward, don't you think the stove is rather hot?" had suggested that it should be allowed to rage unchecked until lunchtime, and then be allowed to die down, after which the accumulated heat, plus the heat from far too many people crowded together in one room, would make a delightful atmosphere. Kate felt much happier, and though at intervals her imagination still toyed with the idea of the slowly smoldering beam, we are happy to inform our readers that, owing to the chimney having no beam anywhere near it, nothing of the sort happened. The great question of the stove being settled, Kate was able to give her full attention to the arrangement of the room. The Hosier's boys, with a great deal of pleasurable and unnecessary shouting and shoving, were getting the trestle tables up and placing the chairs. On the tables, the vicar's wife, the doctor's wife, and Mrs. Burkett were fastening large, gay paper tablecloths with drawing pins and putting a cup and plate on each chair. Paper table napkins with borders of bright red and green holly were also provided, though with but little hope of their being used. By each cup were 2 straws, and this was a stroke of genius on the part of the vicar's wife, who had noticed from many years' experience that tea for children meant fuss, mess, and a great expense of sugar, whereas lemonade needs no adjuncts of sugar or milk, did not stain their clothes so badly, and if drunk through a straw, became a treat of the highest order. It was therefore decided that the tea urns should be used only for the grown-ups, who would refresh themselves after the children had been served. On a spare table in front of the urns, Eileen from the Red Lion, co-opted to the committee as a compliment to Mr. Brown, who had lent a quantity of cups and spoons, Miss Hampton and Miss Bent were cutting the loaves into slices and covering them with liberal applications of margarine and fish paste. All 3 ladies smoked incessantly and kept up a conversation about local affairs to which only the initiates of the Red Lion Bar had any clue. Mrs. Moreland, who was not much good with her hands, had given herself the job of tidying, by which she means that she was able to infuriate all the helpers in turn, sometimes by folding up and putting away in a corner the paper and boxes they particularly wanted, sometimes by sweeping dust and breadcrumbs into little heaps which were trodden upon and scattered before she could come back with a dustpan. A large Christmas tree, sent by Lord Pomfret through his agent Roddy Wicklow, had already been planted in a tub of earth, the tub being lent by Mr. Brown, and the earth by McBean, the head gardener of Southbridge School, who grudged it bitterly, but could not resist Kate Carter's gentle insistence. Boxes and bags of toys and ornaments lay about ready for decorating its branches. This important part of the work was under the supervision of Mrs. Phelps, who had decorated Christmas trees in every part of the globe since her early married days, and usually in those parts of our empire, or other people's empires, where Christmas comes in the middle of the summer. Under her were Miss Phelps as flag lieutenant and Mrs. Burkett and Kate as warrant officers. "The tub looks a bit bare," said Mrs. Phelps, who looked very majestic with a brightly flowered overall over her zip lumber jacket and blue serge trousers. "Do you remember, Margot, the year Irons was at Flinders and we had that gum tree and a huge block of ice for the wives and children at the gridiron and the andiron?" Kate wanted to know if it didn't melt very quickly, as in Australia it was summertime in winter. "Ice doesn't melt if you have enough of it," said Mrs. Phelps, who was unpacking the toys with great dispatch. "Irons got a shallow tank from the naval barracks and we stood the ice in it with some freezing salt. It looked very well. Margot put paper Union Jacks all over it. We ought to have something to drape around the tub. Do you remember, Margot, the year we were at Tricomley and that nice Casanama draped the box our tree stood in with yards of colored muslin? Now, what could we use? You haven't got a few flags, have you, anyone?" But at this moment Matron, who had given herself a roving commission to help in all fields of service, suddenly appeared in her white overall, followed by the biggest hosier's boy, who was carrying a large bulky parcel. "What a busy hive," said Matron, looking admiringly at the scene. "What do you think, Mrs. Carter? I was just giving Jessie a hand to turn out that cupboard in the maid's sitting room, because I said, 'Jessie, it is just as well to see exactly what we have in the cupboard while we are about it, for you know the way things get put away, and you cannot lay your hands on them just when you want them most,' when lo and behold, what did Jessie find on the top shelf which I had absolutely forgotten about? So I asked Manners to carry it down like a good lad, saying to myself, 'Now that is exactly the thing.'" Upon which simple explanation, Matron proudly undid the parcel and revealed a huge roll of green baize. "There," said Matron with some pride, "the very piece of green baize, Mrs. Carter, that Mr. Carter bought for the doors between the house and the servants' quarters on the first and second floors, but owing to a slight misunderstanding, the governors had them redone with red baize, so there it has been all this time. Of course, you wouldn't have known about it," said Matron, who, though she was devoted to Kate, liked to remind herself that she had known Mr. Carter before his marriage. "And I said to Jessie, 'Well, Jessie,' I said, 'that will be exactly the thing,' so Manners carried it down, and quite a weight, wasn't it, Manners?" Manners, who was one of the hosier's most brilliant boys, and had just been elected to an open scholarship at Cambridge, was quite used to being treated as a bright imbecile by Matron, whose class feeling was very strong, and smiled engagingly, saying that he'd often carried heavier parcels for his dad on his rounds. As everyone knew that Manners' father was a greengrocer and furniture remover in those districts beyond the East End from which the Hosier's Boy Foundation School drew most of its pupils, they all liked him the more for frank statement, and Kate suggested he should go and help Mrs. Brown of the Red Lion to cut up the great slabs of currant and cherry cake and eat all the bits that fell off, which he most willingly did. Mrs. Phelps exclaimed aloud with pleasure over the green baize, which she said would give just the touch of old England that she wanted. She and Miss Phelps then draped it in folds and billows round the tub, and when Kate had sprinkled a shilling's worth of artificial frost over it, the effect was pronounced quite fairy-like. Then Miss Phelps, mounting a step-ladder, hung festoons of silver tinsel among the boughs and began to fasten the gold, silver, red, and blue glass ornaments on the higher branches. "What shall I put on the top, Mother?" said Miss Phelps. "One of the silver stars?" Matron, who had had a mysterious air of one biding her time, suddenly produced a cardboard box and said she couldn't resist bringing a little contribution. The contribution was a china-faced doll with a yellow wig, dressed by Matron's skillful hands in cloth of silver, with short full skirts, a silver star on top of her head, and a silver wand in her right hand. Mrs. Phelps said it reminded her of the doll their number 1 boy had dressed for the tree at Hong Kong. Miss Phelps tied it firmly by the waist to the topmost twig, and Matron was enchanted. "Well, that's about enough," said Miss Hampton, strolling over from the sandwich table. "Eileen must get back to the Red Lion at 12. Bent and I must show up, too. Doesn't do to let people down. Where's Mannerheim?" "Do you mean Manners?" said Kate. "He's helping Mrs. Brown with the cake." "Manners," said Miss Hampton, casting a monocled glance in the direction of the table. "Don't know the lad. No, Mannerheim. Oh, Bent has got him." Bent came up, leading the elephant-faced dog. "He knows his name, you see," said Miss Hampton proudly. "Changed it last week. Must do something for gallant little Finland. Thought of Calavella, but no one knows how to pronounce it. Sounds Indian, too. Fine fellows, the Indians, but can't call them gallant, not yet at least." Kate said she thought our Indian troops were very, very brave. "Brave as tigers," said Miss Hampton. "Lithe as panthers, too, but can't call people gallant till they've got their backs to the wall. Hope India never will have her back to the wall." "Come along, Hampton," said Miss Bent. "I can't hold Mannerheim much longer. He knows it's 12 o'clock as well as I do. Ready, Eileen?" Eileen, who had just had a new platinum bleach and looked more beautiful than ever, said it had been quite a treat to cut up the sandwiches for the kiddies, but she must say ta-ta now, as the lads would be waiting, and so departed with Miss Hampton and Miss Bent, the ci devant Smigleyritz, in tow. They had only been gone a few moments when Philip Winter and Captain Fairweather came in, having, as they explained with a wealth of apology, just had breakfast. Kate and Matron, who liked nothing better than to see men overeat and oversleep themselves, beamed approval, and as the work was now finished, they all went back to lunch, leaving Edward the odd man to put the final touches by winding yards of electric flex with colored lights strung on it about the tree. In the middle of lunch, Geraldine arrived, having previously said that she wouldn't be home till 2:30. 3 people rang up for Mrs. Burkett, who wouldn't give their names when Simnett asked them, and took offense. Mrs. Gissing rang up Mrs. Burkett, saying that it was urgent. Mr. Burkett growled, but Mrs. Burkett said she supposed she'd better go in case it was about the party. "Well, what did she want?" said Mr. Burkett when his wife came back. "What to wear," said Mrs. Burkett. "She seems to think it is a fancy dress party and wanted to know if she should come as a Red Cross nurse or as visiting royalty." On hearing the name Gissing, Geraldine became aloof and ill-tempered, which her parents rightly diagnosed as the effects of love. Mrs. Morland, who was dramatizing the stirring nature of the day by taking even less trouble than usual about her hair, dropped 2 tortoiseshell hairpins on the floor during pudding, and as her host bent rather stiffly to pick them up, he felt that for 2pence he would go to bed till after Christmas and stay there. The party was to begin at 4 and end at 6. By 3 o'clock, the helpers were in their places, and just as well, for at 3:15 precisely, Sister Mary Joseph and her flying squadron of white-robed nuns arrived with 36 children spotlessly clean, though unprepossessing, saying that the children had all been ready since 2 o'clock, and it was eating their hearts out they were, and sure we could be young but once. Her lambs, who having eaten their hearts out now had a hearty appetite, began to storm the tables and had to be kept at bay by a strong cordon of nuns and hosiers' boys, until the Hiram Road School poured in, when the 2 schools had so much to do in eyeing each other suspiciously and giggling that the cordon was able to relax. They were quickly followed by St. Bathos and the Pocklington Road School, and a crowd of mothers and children, so that by the hour at which the party was supposed to begin, the gymnasium was quite full of humanity. "I think," said Mrs. Bissell to Kate, "that they had better have tea at once. When they see food, they get restive." "Don't they have enough to eat, then?" asked Kate in some distress. "Quite enough," said Mrs. Bissell, "but they are greedy and selfish and have no manners." "Oh, Mrs. Bissell, the poor little things," said Kate. "You see, Mrs. Carter," said Mrs. Bissell calmly, "I know them. I taught until my marriage. Come here, Janice, and let Mrs. Bissell put your ribbon right. You can't really love them, Mrs. Carter, but you can do your duty by them. If I hadn't married Mr. Bissell, I'd be teaching them still. That's right, Janice, run along now. The worst of our profession, Mrs. Carter, is that you cannot really like your colleagues or your pupils, but it is a privilege to be able to devote oneself to the children, and Mr. Bissell and I, being all in all to each other, do not see much of our colleagues, except during working hours, which I can assure you is a great relief. I think tea immediately, Mrs. Carter. Sister Mary Joseph is losing control, and if she does, all the others will." Acting on this advice, Kate told the four principals that tea was now ready. Sister Mary Joseph, with the utmost dexterity, at once whisked her flock into their places, while the rest of the schools played a kind of musical chairs, at the end of which some 20 children remained standing. By the united efforts of the hosiers' boys and the helpers, a few extra forms were brought in, some supplementary teas were spread, and in a few moments the air was thick with the bolting of paste sandwiches, chocolate biscuits, and slabs of cake, while cup after cup of lemonade was upset, straw and all, as the young scholars grabbed for more food. With the rapidity of a flock of locusts, they stripped every plate of its contents, looking at each other with suspicious eyes as they crammed their flushed and shining faces with food. The helpers rushed backward and forward, replenishing plates till the last crumb of their reserves had been used. Meanwhile, the crackers, which had been provided, were torn open, for a large number of children did not know about pulling them, and the even larger number who did both despised and feared the method, preferring to disembowel the crackers without delay. Mrs. Phelps had ordered nothing but caps and musical instruments. The clamor became deafening. All the children got up and banged into each other deliberately, while they puffed and blew crumbs into the whistles, mouth organs, and other wind instruments provided for them. The hosiers' boys, who were really invaluable, cleared away the crockery, took down the tables, thus giving the evacuees plenty of room to fight, as well as bang and bump and puff. Mrs. Moreland, looking on from the door of the gymnasium changing room, where she was helping to wash up, thought she had never seen a more revolting sight than so many hot children, the girls with their party frocks already crumpled and stained, the boys smeared with food from ear to ear, their unprepossessing faces full of an almost bestial look of satiety that cake and lemonade can produce even in the most gently nurtured young. So she went back into the washing up. The helpers now got the tea urns into action and fed the mothers and teachers, who were to have a slightly more refined tea of paste sandwiches and mixed biscuits. By the time this second tea was over, a great many of the children were in tears with excitement, and it was evident to any motherly eye that a number of them would probably be sick before bedtime. But such is pleasure. Kate asked Mrs. Bissell, who was entirely unperturbed by the scene, to say that the presents would now be given from the Christmas tree. "Now, children," said Mrs. Bissell, and a hush fell on the room, "come up quietly, each school together, and no pushing. Anyone who pushes will go to the back." The schools were rapidly organized. Mr. Hedgebottom managed to get the Hiram Road School into the front of the queue, hoping that his unpriest-ridden charges would get the pick of the presents, though in this he was disappointed, for Mrs. and Miss Phelps, who were responsible for the gifts, were the soul of impartiality, and Miss Hampton and Miss Bent, who actually presented them, with Mrs. Bissell and Kate as bodyguard, did not know one child or one present from another. When every boy had received something considered suitable for a boy, and every girl something considered suitable for a girl, they all tried to take each other's presents away, and the noise was worse than ever. In the middle of it, Geraldine, who had really been working very hard all day and was feeling tired, for there had actually been 6 cases in her ward on the previous day, and matron had let her go on a real night duty for a treat, suddenly saw Mr. Gissing, accompanied by his mother, who was roped with silver foxes and pearls. "Hello, Fritz," she said. and her heart would let her say no more. Young Mr. Gissing, who really has very little to do with this story except to show how easy it is for anyone to fall in love with a totally unworthy object, said, "God, what a smell, and was there a drink anywhere?" Geraldine, who had secretly been exercised about this all day and would have brought some gin with her, but that A, her father had not opened the new bottle and might ask questions, and B, she felt that she had no genius for smuggling at all, exhausted herself in apologies. "Your lovely furs," said Kate to Mrs. Gissing, with a woman's real admiration for silver foxes. "You really oughtn't to have brought them. Do be careful not to get anything on them. I'm afraid everything is very sticky." Mrs. Gissing, smiling a queenly smile, said to Sister Mary Joseph, who was standing near, that she thought one should always wear one's prettiest things when one went among poor children. It was, she said, a kind of duty to give pleasure. To these beautiful words, Sister Mary Joseph's answer was that the children had had a very pleasant afternoon, accompanied by a calm look which conveyed to Mrs. Gissing that she, Sister Mary Joseph, could give pleasure to anyone at any moment by simply existing, and that, being always dressed in an extremely becoming uniform, she never needed to think of what effect she was making. She then gently moved a step aside and replaced a pink bow in one of her children's hair. Mrs. Gissing, for whom one may be a little sorry, then tried to talk to Mrs. Bissell and to Miss Carmichael of St. Pathos School, but finding it somehow impossible to condescend to either of them, gave it up as a bad job and floated graciously toward her son and Geraldine. Geraldine, hoping to propitiate her soul's idol, said how lovely it would be if he could make a film of the entertainment, to which young Mr. Gissing crushingly replied that there was enough junk on the market as it was. As if the Gissings were not bad enough, Madame Brownskew chose this moment to force her way through the crowd, carrying a large wooden box. As she had not been invited, no one was surprised or pleased to see her. But Kate, who simply could not help being kind, received her beside the Christmas tree and said what a pity she hadn't come before to see the children at tea. "I do not come because I am bringing something for you," said Madame Brownskew. "You English do not understand Christmas, which is a strongly religious festival. In Mixolydia, our peasants each slaughter a goose, which is eaten by all, and then they go to church." Kate said in England we usually went to church in the morning and had a goose, or more often a turkey, for lunch, so it was nice to think that the Mixolydians did the same sort of thing. "But I shall show you what it is to make a real Christmas," said Madame Brownskew, ignoring Kate. And thereupon she opened the box and placed it on a chair. It contained a small creche with brightly painted paper figures of the Virgin and Child, Joseph, kings, shepherds, and angels. On each side of it was a fat candle stump. These Madame Brownskew lighted. Even the cheapest creche at Christmas time sends a prickle up and down one's spine and into one's throat. Kate and her helpers found themselves almost gulping at the sight of the two flames illuminating the pretty, touching toy. "So, now is the devil driven away," said Madame Brownskew with great complacency. Such of the children as were near crowded round to look. "Oh, Mrs. Bissell," said Kate, "the doll on top of the Christmas tree." Mrs. Bissell, again calming the tumult by her extraordinary power, announced that the youngest girl present was to have the doll, which Miss Phelps got down from the tree. To avoid complications, Mrs. Bissell had made previous inquiries in all 4 schools and ascertained that Patricia O'Rourke of St. Quantock's was the youngest girl at the party. Sister Mary Joseph, who had been primed by Mrs. Bissell, drew forward a little girl in a stiff pink organdy frock with an enchanting face, guileless of all expression except greed and bewilderment, and a mop of fair curls. Miss Phelps put the doll into her arms, and Sister Mary Joseph said thank you for her, as she was too shy to speak. The little girl stood by the creche, hugging her silver-clothed doll with its uninteresting china face and its crown and star. "What is it, Patricia?" said Sister Mary Joseph, who saw rather than heard her say something. She stooped and listened. "She wants to know if it's the Holy Virgin," said Sister Mary Joseph, smiling kindly down at her charge. Mr. Hedgebottom, who was not looking at the creche, as he afterward explained to one of his assistant masters, but just happened to be there, heard the remark and looked at Sister Mary Joseph with all the gall of which his communist face was capable, and could barely control himself before such a hideous example of Mariolatry. At that moment, one of his young scholars, a promising lad of 9 or 10, pointed a very dirty, sticky finger at the creche and said in a loud voice, "What's that?" Sister Mary Joseph was human, but she behaved very well. She merely cast on the questioner a look of such compassion that Mr. Hedgebottom nearly burst. For the first time in his painstaking and unpleasant life, he saw that entire ignorance of what he called fetishism had publicly humiliated him in the person of one of his most promising scholars, and he clashed his uppers and unders together with rage, resolving to put his whole school through a course of religious teaching, of course from a purely economic and anti-Christian point of view, so that they should not let him down again in public. To add to his humiliation, Mr. Simon of the Pocklington Road School and Miss Carmichael of St. Bathos had been close by and had witnessed his discomfiture, the one from a Baptist, the other from a Church of England point of view. And though Mr. Hedgebottom bitterly despised them both, he would have liked them to be somewhere else. Well, we're not quite done with the Christmas party, and we'll finish it up next time.